to Howard County Spending Affordable Advisory Committee meeting. Happy Lunar New Year, by the way. We just started a new year of the rabbit and wish everybody and your family a healthy and a happy 2023. Today we have two major items on the agenda. The first one is an important one, is Dr. Clinch is going to provide us an updated outlook on the economy and also some of the personal income information that's going to inform the county development of general fund revenues here. And we know Dr. Irani last week already did a very nice presentation about more national and regional economic outlook. And Dr. Clinch's one is going to focus a little more on local economy, although he's also going to talk about the global background of the economy. Then after that, we will go to the second item, which is also critical, is we already have a draft report of HOCO by design fiscal impact analysis, like input from this committee. That's a special charge for the committee this year. So we want to go over that in detail with the committee and see whether there's any feedbacks that we need to take back so we can fine tune it and bring it back on the following week's meeting. Then we can make that report official. So Dr. Irani, are you able to see it on the screen, the slides?
Yes.
Okay, wonderful. Please go ahead. Thank you.
Sure. Yeah, as Holly said, following Darius, he did a superb national and Maryland economic outlook. So I'm really going to talk about them just in the context of how they really impact Maryland, then kind of dive right into the Howard County revenue and economic outlook. As you know from previous years, I really focus on three things that are real the drivers of county taxation, which is population and workforce, county businesses and real estate, and then I'll end with my personal income forecast. So Holly, if you could advance the slide. This is a big change from last year. So we've really gone from an economic recovery to a risk of recession. On the top chart there, you kind of saw the U.S. business cycle map, which, last year, 47 states were recovering, 4 were expanding. So the economic outlook looked great when we did this last year in January. And then, of course, in February, lots of things happened globally. Russia invaded Ukraine, causing, huge supply chain issues, which exacerbated inflation, which was caused, already pretty high from, the fiscal stimulus during COVID. So we went from a kind of positive economic outlook to an at-risk. So if you look at the map on the bottom, that's the business cycle this year, which has that, only 8 states are still recovering and 40, most states are really at risk, which is to say that Moody's has no idea whether they're going to grow or decline in the coming year. So, that said, how did the economy do last year? In 2022, growth was less than half of what the projections were going into the year. Again, because of all the different things that happened. And for 2023, Moody's is projecting that the national economy grow by just over 1%. Board of Revenue Estimates is always very pessimistic, and they say the national economy will grow by 1/3%. So, with again, relatively slow and stable employment growth. So the national economic outlook is, again, as I said, gone from gloomy to, from positive to at risk. Holly, if you could advance the slide. So, just kind of looking at what is driving this national economic uncertainty, there's that traditional curse, which is may you live in interesting times. These are very interesting times for economists. And I think if you get 5 economists in a room, you get 6 or 7 opinions of what's really going to be going on. But the job market, strong but slowing. So as you can see, the top chart in the middle, kind of the national non-farm payrolls, continuing to grow, but the growth is declining, which again is good because it means that hopefully the inflationary pressures are stimulating. Inflation is that next chart on the top. It's high by historical standards, but it's moderating. So again, it has been very negative news for the last year in inflation, but it's getting better. Now wages, they're growing, but they're not keeping pace with inflation. So wages are up around 5%, inflation by about 6%. So overall, people are suffering from, you know, kind of a loss in real purchasing power. And I think the interesting thing is when you look at consumer confidence from the conference board, the line on the blue on the top is present expectations. The orangish line on the bottom is expectations for future. And what you can see here is that the expectations for where the economy is going are about as low as they were in the middle of the COVID recovery. So nationally, people are worried. They should be worried. There's inflation, there's lots of uncertainty, but maybe they're overdoing it a little bit in the worry. And I think Moody's, despite calling some of their product the dismal science or dismal scientist, is basically saying that a U.S. economic recession in 2023, despite its frequent mention and the preponderance of gloomy predictions, is not inevitable. So that's really up from about 3-4 months ago when you track this. So the national outlook, again, from positive to at risk, with some possible signs that things are going to improve. If you could go to the next slide. Really, both Moody's and the Board of Revenue Estimates are in agreement on the Maryland economy, that we're slowly growing. We have not reached full recovery, and it's going to be slow going into the future. Maryland has not been keeping pace with the nation in terms of the recovery. Maryland is losing population. So basically, the projections are for slow and steady growth, with the Board of Revenue Estimates projecting that employment's going to grow by 1.3% in this year, and less than 1% going out. Moody's is a little bit more positive. Personal income growth, again, returning to stability of about 4 to 5% growth going forward. Again, these are reductions from previous years and are really predicated on the fact that we're having a soft landing or a very moderate recession. If you could advance the slide. Holly, do we want to take questions? If anybody has a question, just go ahead and do it, although you've seen some of this before. If you go to the next slide.
Yeah, I think we have plenty of time today. If people want to, you can just unmute yourself and ask Dr. Clinch directly and when the slide is due on the screen. Thank you.
If you could hit the next slide. Advance one more. Not moving. Holly? Oh. Can people hear me? Am I going out?
Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can't hear you. Can you move the slide?
Yeah, I'm moving it. Somehow it's not showing. Let me retry it. Hold on 1 minute.
Okay. I thought I was gone. Yeah, so if you could go back 2 or 3. Yeah, this one. Yep, that should be at 5. Thank you. Oh.
Okay, go ahead. Thank you.
All right, so Darius did a great job setting the outlook. I just wanted to kind of bring it home today and kind of talk about how it put it in the context of what I'm thinking about the county economy. So kind of jumping into the county economy, when since we're more concerned with fiscal conditions in the county. So there's lots of things that make up the economy. We can think about incomes, we can think about retail sales, but really what we're interested in as a committee is fiscal conditions. And fiscal conditions in this county are really driven by 2 revenue streams: property taxes and income taxes. These account for 67% of all fund revenue, so all government receipts for the county government, and 84% of general fund revenues, kind of with the difference being one-time taxes, different smaller taxes, and federal and state government transfers. So what really drives this fiscal forecast is population growth, which really drives property and income taxes, because people have to live somewhere, driving property taxes, and they earn income, and which drives income taxes, which is a big. So population growth is really the biggest determinant of long-term growth in the county. Economic growth, which is employment growth in the county, which again drives property taxes, because these businesses are in the office buildings and factories and warehouses in Jessup and those types of things, but they also employ significant numbers of county residents. So you get, income taxes from that. And again, the real estate conditions, which really drive the property taxes, which are the largest single source of revenue. So if we could advance to the next one, I'm going to go into each of these and begin with what I think is going on and what it means. So in terms of population growth, this is important because it really drives both property and income taxes. So population growth is really the key driver for county fiscal conditions. Overall population growth is slowing, and workforce. People, just moving here isn't enough. They have to work and pay income, right? So that's better. And a workforce, there's again the worrying signs that we saw from the Economic Development Authority and others have talked about, that workforce growth is not yet recovered, and labor participation is falling. And so again, that's a worrying sign, but I think one that we can mitigate or will go away in the future. So if you could go into the next slide. Basically, you can divide this into long-term and short-term population growth patterns. And the Census Department has just put out new population growth, which makes it hard to do a long-term projection. So I divided this out into kind of the long-term and the changing current conditions. This is the same slide as last year for those of you who remember what I talked about, which I doubt is many. But again, long-term, we've been a leader in growth. Over the last decade, or the previous decade, we were 5th in population change, 2nd in population growth. You added almost 14,000 housing units, and we're already a pretty dense county. So if you could advance the slide. Using the more recent numbers, this is really slowing, and there's some interesting things going on, I think. So, so we're 4th in population change, 9th in population growth. Our growth is less than half the rate of the previous decade. We're 5th in new housing units and 7th in housing unit growth. So again, we're continuing to grow and keep pace. So if you go to the next slide, when you look at the composition of the change, again, you're going to see a changing pattern that I think is relevant for the future. So you can talk about population change being made up of 2 major things: natural change, which is the difference between births and deaths, and net migration, which can again be divided into international migration, which is growing across the nation and very highly in Maryland, and domestic change, which is changes from within the country. And in the context of a county, it also counts people moving from one jurisdiction to another. So we're strong in population change growth. So our population is still growing naturally, which but more than half of counties are not experiencing. We're gaining residents from migration, which is mostly domestic migration. And that's interesting again, because Howard County has really, migration in the previous decade was the real driver of growth, and a lot of that being in-state migration. So people moving from higher tax jurisdictions like Montgomery County to Howard County, or lower service jurisdictions like Prince George's County, and coming here for our attractive quality of life and strong schools. Now, when you look at the counties around the state, the outer counties like Frederick and Charles are still growing from migration. So they're still experiencing this. They're gaining residents from neighboring jurisdictions and out of state. And all the big counties, with the exception of Anne Arundel, are losing population, mostly from out migration. A lot of this is to out of state, retirees moving to Florida, but also, residents moving to lower cost jurisdictions in the state of Maryland. So, we have a more balanced growth. It's going to be, both a combination of natural growth and migration as the housing market kind of slows, which will be the next slide. So if we could hit the next slide. Workforce growth, which Holly has asked me to add 2 or 3 years ago, after a decade of really outpacing Maryland. So Howard County is orange, the state is blue. The top is resident labor force, so people who are engaged in working activities. And the bottom is the change in employed residents, which is the number of people actually working. So resident workforce, after more than a decade, probably 2 or 3 decades of outpacing Maryland, workforce declined by 3% in 2020, 1.2% in 2021, which again hadn't happened since the 2009 recession. Employee residents fell a little bit less than the state. And both, Howard County's resident workforce and employed residents continue to recover, but still remain below pandemic levels, pre-pandemic levels, which again has the implication that these are our core taxpayers. So there's less of them working, which will imply less revenue in the long run, which again goes to the next slide, which you could advance. Labor force participation rates, this is the share of people, who reside in the county actually, participating in the workforce. The 2020 is estimated because the COVID, the ACS, the American Community Survey from the census didn't come out. So that number is just the difference between the previous, the year bracketed years. If you look in the top, Howard County is the gray line. We have a much higher rate of workforce participation in the state and nation, but this is declining, predominantly because of the aging of the county's population, but also there's cyclical economic effects here. So again, we're seeing a declining labor force participation rate. So in terms of population growth, we're going to have slower population growth going forward as the real estate conditions, which will be something I talked to at the end, and kind of mitigate in the near term some impacts of lower workforce participation. If you could hit the next slide.
Yeah, one quick, I guess, comment is that Dr. Clench there, I think this and the prior slides are really informative, and that also supports what EDA presented a few weeks ago about the workforce issue, because the overall trend, although it's very similar with the state and the national, our school part different, because nationally it looks like workforce participant has been dropping, but slowly in last decade, it's just moving down by 1 percentage point, versus for the county, it's really dropped almost like 5 or 6 percentage point gradually over time. And as you mentioned, the aging is part of reason, but also pandemic related changes, daycare and other issue there. It actually seems to have a more sizable impact on the county. That's what I try to say.
Yeah, so as you can see here, that's a huge drop. The two peaks were 2012 and 2016, when we're at 73.5 and 73.2%. We're down about 5% from those. Again, there's a long-term trend, as Holly said, of an aging population, but also we were hit more severely by the pandemic in terms of workforce participation, which we talked about last year, which I think might be because during the pandemic, with Howard County's highest incomes, fifth or sixth highest in the nation, families, especially dual income families that are the preponderance of families in Howard County, had a greater ability to maybe have one person, step back a little bit and stay home. And that I think we can expect to get a little bit better in the future. If you could hit the next slide in terms of the economy. Let's go into the economy. So this is economic growth, which really what we track here is employment. Employment growth, we really haven't yet recovered. So again, the employment growth is important because it drives non-residential property tax revenues, which again, Larry talked about in terms of the need to grow our commercial property tax base. But also, I think a lot of the workers who work in Howard County, many of them live here. We have a large number, most people work out of the county, but a growing share over the last 2 to 3 decades of in-county work. But I think also one of the things that Larry has talked about in previous years is the fact that as he works to attract businesses into Howard County, their workers being able to find a home in Howard County is important. So again, that many of those people do wish to work here and live here as well. So again, if we go to the economic growth, Jason talked about this, so I'm going to go kind of briefly here. But Howard County was hit hard by the COVID recession. Pre-COVID, you look at the indexed employment on the top here. This is employment index to 2010. Over the decade preceding COVID, or the orange line on the top, grew much more rapidly than the state, than the nation, than the 2 metropolitan areas of which we're bracketed in between. So pre-COVID, everything was great. We're growing more rapidly. Post-COVID, we've really been lagging in the recovery. That's the bottom chart here in Howard County. You can see on the bottom. The U.S. is just under pre-COVID employment. The state is down 3%. DC Metro by 4%. Baltimore Metro down by about 5%. Howard County is down by 7. So really, we were hit about equally as the rest of the state and region by COVID, but it's really been a slow recovery. So if you could hit the next slide. Again, this is the same thing, but looking at Maryland, our comparative performance in Maryland. So pre-COVID, we were one of the fastest growing counties in the state. Yeah, we were 5th in terms of gross job numbers. We were 3rd in the employment growth rate. Post-COVID, we're the 5th worst in job losses and the 6th worst in the percentage decline. So again, it's not that Maryland, which has been a laggard in recovery, is pulling us down. It's we have some issues in our economy that I'll try to address, but I think we'll come back to a better situation. But again, we were hit pretty hard. So if we could hit the next slide. This is the slide I have every year, which is on our sectors, our growth sectors or industry sectors. So this is 2-digit NAICS code. So these are broad industries as defined by the federal government. The ones that are highlighted are what are called specialized industries. There's something called a location quotient, which measures the concentration of employment in Howard County compared to the nation. So if you're at 1, you're exactly at the nation. If you're below 1, you have less of that industry than the nation as a whole. And if you're over 1.2, you're generally considered specialized in that industry, which means you may have a comparative advantage, meaning that it's something that drives your regional economy. So, again, construction, when you look at this, the COVID hit our core sectors pretty hard. Construction had strong pre-COVID growth. It is down 8% since 2019. Manufacturing and transportation, distribution and logistics, this is really Jessup, but other parts of the county as well. Strong pre-COVID growth, strong decline since 2019. Residential serving industries, which you think of retail, accommodations, food service, entertainment. So these are industries that serve us, the county residents, are all well below pre-COVID levels, and these were hit harder than these other sectors. But even the county driver industries, like professional services, business management, corporate headquarters, are recovering and are doing better than these resident serving industries, but are still just above or slightly below, depending on which ones you look at, pre-COVID levels. And I think going into the future, what is going to happen with slower federal spending, which is the real driver of the county economy. So if you could, do we have any questions here, or should I keep going? I'm either putting you to sleep or answering. You're doing a pretty good job, so I'll keep going. Again, another way of looking at this is more detailed sectors. So the industries on the left-hand side are the top job creating industries for 2014 to 2019. So the 5 years pre-COVID, and those are the good days. The bad days are the top job losing industries over the past 2 years. As we all know and have heard from Larry and others, during the good days, it was great here. Information technology, cybersecurity, manufacturing, transportation, distribution, and logistics all gaining jobs. Residential and demand industries and construction. So again, these resident serving industries were all growing with our incomes and population. Fast forward to COVID, as I talked about, our residential demand industries are key losers. Construction, distribution, logistics, and food manufacturing have been hit pretty hard in our manufacturing sector. And even some of our core industries like electronics and architecture and engineering, so business services, professional services are down. But what's interesting, again, is 6 industries are in both lists. So, many of the things that were doing really well prior to COVID, are the ones that got hit pretty bad by COVID. So that's kind of an overall economic outlook. Any questions here before I go on to real estate? Sure.
Dr. Clinch, this is Steve Point on. Quick question for you on the kind of the downshift, I guess, in some of these industries. How much of that have you done any analysis? How much is due to COVID, and how much is due to other factors such as decisions that jurisdictional decisions that we've made, other things like that, or is it primarily driven by COVID?
I would think it's very hard to do that type of analysis. And there's also probably some weird things going on with the numbers, like, search and navigation equipment declining by so rapidly. I'm not sure that one's necessarily a real change. It might be a NAICS code change. But I think I've looked, last year we talked about which of these are COVID dependent. So when you look at the industries with the biggest job losses, restaurants, amusement services, um, those are really impacted by COVID. Even the distribution market, the TDL, transportation distribution logistics market in Howard County is really driven by food, grocery store, manufacturing, and those types of industries. And again, retail was down, so those were hit. So I think most of this is COVID related and in COVID dependent industries. When you look at things like construction, though, some of it might be a policy issue because we do have the APFO, we do have the high increase in impact fees, but we also have a raising interest rate environment. We also have an uncertain fiscal environment, which you would expect construction to respond to by falling somewhat. So I would say an opinion is that it's mostly COVID dependent with some policy impacts mixed in. Did that come close to answering it?
Yeah, I hear what you're saying, and I appreciate that. So thank you. I still think there's some noise in there, but like you said, it'd be near impossible to figure out.
It is nearly impossible to figure out, why this NAICS code went down unless you go into the company level and look at, is it a company change, is it a company leaving, so that's really hard. And
I mean, the only reason my question is recoverable, right? Is it something that could come back, or is it something that's permanently depressed due to other factors? That's really the only reason I'm asking, because when you look at like forecasts.
I was hoping to get there on one of my last slides. So
all right then. You already led me there. Your slides were so good, you already led me there.
I already led you there. So all right, if we could hit the next slide, I'll do real estate, then I'll get onto that. So again, real estate, again, mixed bag here. Real estate conditions are really the drivers of the county's economy because they drive property taxes, which are 41% of all fund and 45% of general fund revenues. And when you think of the real estate market, you really can think of it into two really most important components: residential, all of our houses, and non-residential, the places we work when we work in the county, or the places we shop when we're in the county. So residential, kind of a mixed bag here. Pricing remains strong. However, units are down, units sold are down. There's a low inventory. In terms of residential, we've talked about this last year. Permitting is down. Jeff talked about this as well. Multifamily is up. Non-residential remains relatively strong, despite, in terms of the numbers. However, as Larry pointed out, growing the commercial tax base, is a slow and steady process. It's not going to grow overnight, but it appears again that our non-residential tax base seems to be doing relatively well in terms of non-residential permitting activities. So if we could hit the next slide. This is my slide that I love, but it doesn't seem to jazz people up as much as I do. It shows the values, which is the green line going up. It shows the inventory, which is the red line, which is going down, and units sold, which has been relatively flat, but growing in the last couple of years, but down flat for the last 2 or 3 years. So what's going on here, I think, is that median sales prices, grew to, they're down from, peaks in terms of the moving average, but they're continuing to grow. They're the second highest in Maryland, and last year we were the 9th in growth. But I think what's interesting again is that inventory is well below units sold. There's only about 6 months, or less than, 0.6 of a month of inventory, which is the lowest in the county, tied with Hartford County. 4,200 units sold in 2022, which is down from 5,400 in 2021. So again, fewer units sold, price escalation, kind of a diminishing supply, but also, as we talked about with the increasing interest rate environment, increasing mortgage rate environment and economic uncertainty, you can also expect real estate to cool down given these national factors. So, the resale value, mostly resale market here, again, is hot prices, declining inventory. If we could hit the next slide.
Yeah, before I go there, and Dr. Clinch, also to support what you just said there on the revenue side, we actually have been seeing it's reflected too. There are some revenues directly relate to the transaction at the real estate market, like a school surcharge, a road excise tax, transfer tax, etc. That has been hit in recent months. They all experienced double-digit decrease here, primarily because of the reason you just mentioned there.
Okay, so the residential development, again, so despite the fact that we have an increasing price environment and declining supply environment, permitting is trending down. Jeff talked about this. I'm not going to go into it very long, but we all, he's gone into the reasons why. Land inventory, we're running out. APFO, which limited the development of activities. The increase in impact fees, which would lower, interest in developing property. But also, as I've talked about, economic uncertainty. Inflation was increasing, interest rates were increasing, mortgage rates were increasing, which again tends to, not only diminish people's appetite for moving to houses, but developer interest in developing new houses in a time of uncertainty. So again, permitting trending down from the long-term rates. The right-hand side is the number of permits, and you can see it's, if you smooth it, it's absolutely pointing down, which again is consistent with what others have said here. If we could hit the next slide. This is again the permitting divided into multifamily and versus single family homes. As we've talked about, for the previous, from the 1980s to the 2000s, early 2000s, we built single family houses in Howard County. Those attracted, upper middle class suburban families with relatively high incomes. We're now increasing as we develop into downtown Columbia and more dense parts of the counties. We're having an increase in multifamily housing, which, as you can see, has gone up to about half of permits issued. And again, as I've talked about, this has implications for the county's personal income growth. Because owner-occupied houses, some multifamily is condo. So again, it's hard to, the census doesn't break it out into condo, apartment, and house. They break it out into owner versus renter occupied. So there's a little bit of noise in these numbers. But again, by and large, I think this is borne out in the fiscal models that the planning department have created. Owner-occupied housing generates higher tax revenues, because the residents have higher incomes. So again, more than 150,000 versus less than 75,000 for renter occupied. But and as we've talked about, there are fewer service demands because from a renter occupied, because there's a lower population or number of residents per unit, but it's not that much lower. So the income is less per unit is less than half. But it's only about half a person less. So it's about 20-something% smaller. So again, this has fiscal implications for the county. And if we could hit the next slide. Non-residential permitting activity remains relatively strong in the county. As this is the dollar values from the Baltimore Metropolitan Council. If you look at what's happened in the last 5 years, despite COVID, despite economic uncertainty, non-residential permitting activity has been pretty strong. But as Jeff talked about, the county is running out of land. Also, there's a lot of uncertainty as to what this will mean in the future going forward. What is the impact of COVID-19 on the real estate market, which is really driven to a large extent by office uses more in the county. And as we talked about last year, there's probably going to be less office space per worker. All of us have seen the increase in use of hot seating and those types of things in offices. There's more retail demand is shifting to online purchases, as we all see in the UPS trucks driving down our streets probably right now. So that used to be stuff we used to buy in stores. So again, places like the mall are going to see relatively less demand than they would have seen in the absence of that. But on the positive side, you're seeing a real shift, especially in the Washington area, to higher demand for suburban office space. As people are, downtown DC, even downtown Baltimore, pricing for office uses are much higher than suburban costs. So there is some movement of office space leasing activity to be closer to workers and less willingness to pay the premium for a downtown office, which again is a positive for demand. So in terms of residential activity or real estate activity, it's slowing but strong residential market and remaining strong non-residential market. So then we'll go into the forecast. If you could hit the next slide, Heidi. Yeah, so again, I've asked for and not received hazard pay for doing this for the past 2 or 3 years. It's hard to make predictions in this environment. I think in a way this might be harder than last year. You know, COVID is becoming the new normal. They're talking about it being with us for a long time. We have a war in Ukraine, which is, are we going to give the Ukrainians tanks? Does that lead to escalation? Lots of uncertainty there. Global supply chain was a disaster last year. It's recovering, but COVID is expanding in China right now. So what's going to happen to global supply chains? Inflation high, but moderating. This is a completely different inflationary environment than we would have had without the war in Ukraine, because pre-war inflation was really driven by the fiscal stimulus. This is driven by global economic uncertainty and supply chains. The recession, the risk of recession nationally ranges from who you talk to, from 50 to 70%. But as Moody's talked about, it's not inevitable. There's increasing talk of a soft landing, which I hope comes true, but I think the tea leaves are pretty hard to read. A risk of a recession in Maryland, according to Moody's, is 50-50, which is to say they really don't know. And they're not even publishing their forecasts. I had to call and get this from them. And if all of that economic uncertainty is enough, we have the debt ceiling negotiations going on right now, which could crash not just the local economy, because we're federally dependent, but the global economy as well, if we don't settle on that. So if you could hit the next slide, which kind of gets to Steve's point, what does all this mean for projections, and what do I think about it? Real estate, I think we have price stability, slower unit growth, as Holly talked about. So we're going to have continuing low population growth, but some of these one-time taxes we get from transfers and things like that are going to be lower. We have moderating population growth, but continued recovery in labor force participation. I think that, as barring an economic, recession stronger than anybody thinks, labor force participation should return to much higher than the state level, maybe not the highs of 70-something%, because we are an aging population. But I think we can expect, people to go back to work at an increasing rate in the county and get back to above it. So that should be positive on taxes. In county employment, there's no reason for many of these industries to have declined. I think there's a lot of noise from COVID and reshuffling. So depending on how negotiations on fiscal, on the debt ceiling go, and federal spending, which is obviously going to be scaled back, and federal spending does drive the county's economy directly and indirectly. We don't have a lot of federal employment in the county in terms of offices or departments, but we have lots of federal workers and lots of federal suppliers in the county. But when you think of cybersecurity, you think even of food manufacturing, I think we can expect continued recovery to get back to where we were. Those job losing industries, with the exception possibly of construction, should come back to pre-recession levels pretty soon. So I think, I believe this is COVID. I believe this is short term. I believe we should get back to slower but steady growth. So the result would be real fiscal stability is probable for the next 1 to 2 budget cycles at least. And I don't think anybody knows what's going to happen in 3 years, because none of us really know what's going to happen in the next 6 months. And my premise here is we're expecting a moderate recession or soft landing. If there's lots of things that can upset this apple cart, and if things go the way they should go, these predictions are true. But if we, lots of things can happen that could upset this. So if we could hit the last slide, and I'll stop putting everybody to sleep with economics, which nobody should have to hear at 7 in the morning. I'm predicting slow and stable growth of 2.6% in personal income in 2022. This was better than my last year estimate, which was kind of baking in a recession at this point. The issue is here that this projection is in current dollars. So this is actually a slight decrease when you think of it inflationary. kind of full recovery in 2023. So again, predicated on this soft landing or no recession hypothesis, and to track state growth going forward. The county has historically grown slightly more strongly than the state. So if you look at the bottom again, kind of state personal income growth of mid fours to low fives for the coming years, and us doing slightly better than that. So again, I think a stable fiscal environment for the next 2 years at least.
So one quick question, Dr. Clinch. This projection are kind of like related to what you said earlier, is your assumption about like fiscal stability, right? As a main assumption in this period of time, not factoring in a recession, right? For this.
This is based really on a very moderate recession in mood. The county model that I've developed, you can't build a bottoms-up county fiscal model because there's such a lag in county data. So This is really a share model of how do we do relative to the historic. So because a moderate recession with full recovery by the end of 2023, or the actual soft landing that I think has been pulled off. Darius, correct me if I'm wrong. I think 2 or 3 times in the last 50 years happens. So this is baked in because it's baked. Those are baked into the state's forecasts and the national forecasts. So yes, it's predicated on the fact that we do not have a bad recession. It's predicated on a very mild recession with full recovery by 2023, or an actual soft, or the economist's dream of a soft landing.
Okay, thank you. And also, I think a point you just touched upon is also important is 2022 was projected by you and the state as a moderate growth there, but it's at the same time, that's a time that we have historically relatively high inflation. So as you said, inflation is more than 6%. So even the growth number is okay on the personal income, but if you really factor inflation, it's actually below inflation in this period of time.
Well, I either did a really good job or I put everybody to sleep. So kind of any questions?
Todd here. I do have a question. I had an interesting meeting with a pretty well-known commercial real estate broker last week, and he said one of the things that's alarming to him is how many commercial buildings are fully leased and empty. And his concern is that although those leases are currently being paid, they're not going to be renewed. And a lot of those spaces are on longer term leases. So they're rolling off over time. So the question is, irrespective of the issue of recovery, it's the evolving nature of commercial real estate right now. And what happens if those commercial spaces are not renewed and they continue to sit empty, but they're not leased? And so valuation goes down considerably. What happens with those properties over time as the economy evolves away from fixed office locations?
I wish if I could answer that, I would be starting my hedge fund tomorrow. And maybe I could find somebody silly enough to invest with me. Nobody really. I just finished Prince George's County's economic development strategy. I talked to every major developer active in Prince George's County. So people who've made and lost much more money than I have. And the answer from them, from what's going to happen to it. So again, you have to talk about what is the segment of the market you're dealing with. And the answers they've given me range from suburban is going to come back strong because of what I talked about, that there's going to be a flight from the downtown areas, especially much more rapidly in the DC area, where the differentials are so high between suburban, again, where the workers are, and downtown costs. So the answer is, I think the real estate bloodbath in terms of retail is worked its way out. And so the lower and less problematic in Howard County. than say Prince George's County, where you have a lot of older strip centers that aren't, you know, really underperforming. The office market, again, if you read, you know, JDL or any of these things, you can get from anything from it's going to come back to it's never coming back. I tend to think that you're going to go down to a smaller footprint, you know, probably companies, because of use of flexible space, are going to go down to probably half to a third, but still some space. And increasing companies are wanting their workers to come back. So, yeah, I think in the long run, we're going to come back, and places like Howard County are going to do better than, you know, other places. So I think there's going to be, and then the problem of, you know, like, I think the huge like inventory of unused office in Montgomery County was, you're seeing some of them being converted into other uses. You know, some of the office areas that are never going to come back in Montgomery County because they're not near a metro and they're, you know, high cost, low benefit. So I think this is clearly an issue where commercial real estate goes, and I don't have any answers except nobody really knows. But I think Howard County, we can expect whatever happens to do better. We have a growing base of companies. We have an attractive population and workforce of that's in demand, and, you know, lower costs than either of the two downtown markets bracketing us, and proximity to a major employer. So what happens is, if your doomsday scenario that nobody ever sets foot in an office happens, yeah, commercial's dead. But I don't think that's going to happen, and I think you're going to have a long-term return to the office with
Todd
lower
and Dr.
density.
Clinch, this is Steve again. So one thing, and Dr. Clinch, interested in your opinion on this. I mean, our driver for population growth isn't the businesses that are in the community, right? I mean, where a lot of places it would be. I mean, I'm assuming it's still true. You know, a third related to the people in our community that you know, work and live. And so if the bigger issue would be is if the populate or the job drivers outside of our community changed but we're driving people into our community for different reasons. Am I looking at that like too basic?
I think what Todd's asking, but Todd, do tell me if I got it wrong, is you have two things going on. You have your non-residential and residential, and what happens if non-residential collapse. And what you're saying is what happens to residential is really depends. So I think you can both be right here. What Todd's saying is, as a changing, you know, economic structures impact demand for commercial space, what happens to the non-residential tax base in the county? And what you're saying is our residential is entirely dependent on how this broader region goes. So I think both of them can be, you know, correct. Now, Maryland is a slow growth environment. DC has been a slow growth environment. But that, again, there's this, I mean, there's lies, damn lies, and statistics. We also had smaller impacts of the 2009 recession in the region and the state. So, you know, comparative growth rates, when you look at the long term, you know, are a little bit harder to do. But I think the question is, what happens to the federal government? And the near term, we're going to see less demand from the federal government because procurements aren't going to be let. And procurement drives, you know, about 20–30% of the Maryland economy, directly or indirectly. Direct federal employment or procurement. So in the near term, the bigger threat to the Maryland economy, and therefore the bigger threat to the Howard County economy, is the debt ceiling and what happens to procurements and what happens to payroll in the near term. We all know, or we all hope, we're not crazy enough to do anything, you know, to use the nuclear option. But, you know, clearly the last time this happened, procurements were held up for 3 to 6 months from the process that tailed after it. So the bigger threat is what happens to the federal government in the near term and the long term. Long term, the federal government's always been growing. We have a Democrat in office, and the Democrats So, we've always been, I was hired 30 years ago to say that Maryland can't continue to be government dependent. We're more government dependent than we were 30 years ago. Federal government's a great baseline customer to have, but right now the bigger threat is the debt ceiling. I either danced around your question or answered it. So, any other questions?
Hey, Richard, this is Josh Zucker. Maybe your presentation really just confirmed a lot of my priors, or maybe I have my priors and I just selectively use your presentation to confirm them. It seems to me that the biggest long-term, whether it's getting more Howard Countyans into the Howard County workforce, or maximizing tax revenue, or ensuring that we have like a stable growth rate going forward, a lot of it depends on increasing the population of Howard County, and in particular, increasing the population in Howard County of young professionals who want to raise a family in Howard County, or young professional families who want to move to Howard County. So this is not a question as much as just a statement. We have a lot of policies, both on development and on just seemingly picking winners and losers through regulation, of favoring empty nesters, retirees, over drawing in new residents. And in drawing in new residents, what you get is kind of a virtuous cycle. Is if you had a bunch of new residents, you also need a bunch of new everything else, from waiters to dentists. So I'm wondering, like, how we connect what your presentation demonstrated with what our land use policies are, to ensure that we get this cycle, and how much of a impediment are our current policies that favor less development, more old people. How much of a detriment is that to Howard County in general?
Yeah, I completely agree with your premise. The county gets its money from income taxes and property taxes, which is driven by population growth. The higher the income of the resident, the higher the tax revenues, because they're going to bid up, pay more for housing, bid up prices for housing, and earn more and be taxed more. So, we as a committee, I think, can talk about that. Absolutely. Answer it, I don't know, like age restricted housing, those types of things, also are driven by the efforts to maintain qualities of service. So I agree with the premise. I don't have the solutions in my back pocket, but yes, the best way to grow the county's fiscal and economy is attract more dual income, college educated, households. And as you saw with my slide about getting more multifamily, some of that will be younger workers possibly attracted to the area, although areas, those have been increasingly urban for the last decade and a half. So I don't have a good answer, but I agree with your premise.
Yeah, and one quick comment to that, and I agree with both of you, that I remember that earlier when DPZ was talking about Hoko by design, some of those are coping for the trend, including both the aging population, but also probably the young professional as well. Because I remember, for example, the missing middle is a type of house are in more demand, and that's factoring. That's more for people still early in your career and may not need so many so big space there and more affordable price there. If I recall, there was some discussion about that. So, but that's definitely a good point. That something need to be factored in. Any other questions for Dr. Clinch or comments? All right. Thank you very much. This is a
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. And will, as we mentioned earlier, this will be greatly helpful when we are in the process developing forecast for our own revenue and budget development for next year, but also in the following years. Thank you. Our next item will be discussion on HOCO by design fiscal impact analysis, the draft report. So let me shift to the report. Hold on 1 minute. Can you all see it? Okay, I assume you can. Okay. Good morning. So the Spending Vulnerability Advisory Committee is typically, as you know, tasked to provide a report to county executive by March 1st with some comprehensive information on forecast revenue, debt ceiling, different policy recommendations related to budget and fiscal planning. But this year, we also got a special charge that's to develop a report by the end of January as a special report. And basically, the committee was asked to review and provide feedbacks on the fiscal impact analysis of a HOCO by design or draft HOCO by design prepared by the staff, and then put together a kind of very brief report and sent to county executive by end of this month there. So the staff have prepared a concise report based on the discussion and presentation we have been hearing in the last several sessions there. So it was already shared with the committee over the weekend there, but I want to take time to discuss it in case people have any feedbacks or edits there, and we want to collect at the meeting. And also we want to give people one more day. If you have edits there, please send to me and Paul, say by end of next day and tomorrow, so we can fact in and then work maybe with 1 or 2 committee members on the wordsmithing, formatting to get it presentable. Then we will bring it back at our next meeting for very brief voting, because next week is going to be really packed agenda. We'll talk about the school budget. That one was presentation was rescheduled because the superintendent is not going to disclose the proposal until later today. So that meeting was moved to next week, and that's the same meeting next week. We're also going to discuss about revenue projections, multi-year operating and expenditure projections, as well as finance will present the credit rating as well as debt indicators. So next week will be really packed. So I was hoping that today we can pretty much finish the discussion, and next week just kind of quick vote on the report. So the way we're doing is, as we just mentioned, that is very concise report. So I'll go over that in detail, but structurally speaking, it's 4-page of the body of the report. We started with executive summary, has generally talk about the process, what's the committee's charge, and how we met with the staff and experts, subject matter expert there. And based on that, the committee provide various feedbacks there, including suggested changes on 4 different assumptions that was incorporated in the final fiscal impact analysis. There's also extensive discussion about different questions, for example, blueprint, and a lot of other items there that's also touched upon here. And then we talk about the general conclusion of the fiscal impact analysis there. And after there are a few small sections. One is about the background of HOCO by design, based on the HOCO by design overview presented by DBZ. By the way, here's a minor edits there we received on DBZ last night there regarding the timeline. So just kind of factual correction there. And then the next section, and we have attachment, by the way, that's from those presentations as attachment to this report that gives more details. For example, background there's attachment. It's about the fiscal, not the fiscal, but focal by design presentation that was done at the first meeting of the committee. And then fiscal analysis reports results impact. This is a general summary about a positive impact measured in nominal values here. It also has attachment, which is a revised version of the fiscal impact analysis results from Jeff, who's the research director of DPZ, that conducted a fiscal impact analysis there. So here's a summary of the results here with a table that shows annual average and also accumulatively. And then there's also, we talked very lightly on the methodology, basically talk about both the per capita approach as well as a marginal analysis approach there. And the detail is attachment that has like 48 pages laying out all those nitty-gritty and technical details there. And in the end, we have very brief conclusion, primarily using one of the slides from the staff when talk about the implications or things need to keep in mind when moving forward regarding fiscal impact analysis. So that's just a general structure. And after that, we have the attachment of all PDF files, and these are all different materials the committee received during the meetings or reflect a revised version after incorporating the committee's feedback. So that's just a general approach. And we can kind of go over that in a little more detail. And if you have any questions or thoughts there, feel free to bring it up now. We have probably close to an hour left, so I think it will allow a lengthy discussion if needed. So the executive summary, so this first paragraph is just talk about the charge of the committee. The second paragraph was talk about the adjustment that was advised, because if you recall, the committee made really good points about a few elements of the assumptions there that either probably can be changed to better match the updated market trend, because the market trend has been changed over the past year, or take a little bit more prudent approach there. In some cases, for example, our own experience are more positive than national average. But if we want to take a little more conservative approach or more safe approach, we should maybe use a national average. That's what we made adjustment as a home affordability ratio. It's also in response to committee recommendations there, reflecting some potential impact from the remote work trends there. So bring down the non-residential property development number from the original model. So there are several things that was built in, and also the fiscal impact model was revised to reflect nominal value, because rather than just everything measured in 2022 dollar, and the reason is because the budget is always developed in nominal value, including the inflation impact there. So just make everything more connected to real life budgeting. That's the number we should use here. So that's what was adjusted, reflected there. So these are the parts. So I want to pause for 1 minute to see any comments currently before I move on. And by the way, I think when I go through it, people should feel free to stop me and kind of jump in if you have any thoughts. So if I don't hear anything, then I'll just keep going. So I can make it a little bigger, by the way, just for the sake of everyone. So here's the discussion. By the way, if you have any, not content, but like more wording change, grammatic changes there, one sentence can be improved a little bit, that kind of thing there, feel free to either bring up here or after the meeting, send directly to me and Paul. That we'll be happy to incorporate that, because that usually doesn't change the subject. It's mostly just to, make the narratives more smooth, more standardized there. So those kind of edits there, again, you can bring up now, but feel free to send it to us later. We can incorporate. So these are talk about the changes and the scenario tests made. The next one was talked a little bit about the questions there, the more detailed discussion of different clarification on assumptions, on methodology, and other issues there was including attachment there. But one thing that probably worth mentioning is the blueprint, because there's a lot of uncertainty about that issue. So on this issue, it's really complex issue. So the committee heard is that there's a couple of important points. One is that the school system have been working hard, try to come out with preliminary projection on the implementation cost for blueprint there. And that number is a moving target because it has its own complexity and has been updated a couple of times there. The most recent one we got from school system, which I'm sure is still changing, is a preliminary number that tied to the school's fiscal year 23 approved budget, which shows in next 10-year period of time is about 137 million net impact to local costs after account for potential increase of state aid based on the blueprint legislation. So that was what the state, like the school system's number. Again, it's very preliminary, and the school staff was letting us know there are a lot of other uncertainties here. Now, the state actually has a different opinion. The state actually has been saying and putting in official document DLS that because the blueprint legislation is going to provide very significant, I think it's about $4 billion increase of state aid across Maryland for different school system there. That will be huge help to support blueprint implementation. They also mentioned that the purpose of the blueprint implementation is to help different school systems reprioritize on their focus there rather than to create unfunded mandates there. So Howard County, among several other counties here, because historically have been providing more than maintenance effort year after year, and in some years very significantly, we are among several jurisdictions, at least based on state DLS and state MSDE, that we're not likely to incur any unfunded mandates beyond our historical trend of local funding. So that was different from what the schools current projections there. But even based on schools projection there, if you look at the fiscal impact analysis provided by DPZ earlier, that we're already projecting the base funding from the county for school, if we use inflation growth there, next 10 years will be 189 million. So even based on that, this is more than enough to cover what's projected blueprint net cost by the school system there. So that, in other words, it looks like the analysis already adequately accounted for blueprint implementation needs there. So in general, I know the committee has been done due diligence, and there are multiple meetings there with the staff, a very thorough discussion, and some of the technical details. In particular, the experts of committee provide a lot of input and share their experience, observation about the market. And as we talked earlier, there's a couple of ones that was changed, like the capitalization rate and mortgage rate there, and does make, we believe, the final model more accurate in terms of based on the most latest information, realistic assumptions for the next 20 years here. So that's already incorporated. So at this point, I don't think the committee, at least for now, I haven't heard additional discussion from the committee on new changes there. And every feedbacks received, the staff already fully incorporated in the analysis there. So as a result, I think the committee believe the methodology assumptions are reasonable and the results are valid. And based on the results there, I think Jeff already mentioned the last time, but just to reemphasize there, the revised model incorporate all the feedbacks there is currently projecting an average net revenue gain of $59 million per year in the next 18 years there. So there are new revenues, then there are also new costs there. So the net amount is the difference between the two. And total projected net gains in the 18 years between between calendar year 2023 to 2040 is about $1.06 billion in this period of time. And that was based on Hochul by Design's projection of 25,000 new residential units and 31,500 new jobs from non-residential property in this period of time. And obviously, if you look at this there, the conclusion, it will result a positive fiscal impact pretty significantly, in fact, from the Hochul by Design plan. And the committee also, I think it's important to point it out there through our conversation with staff, is that again, every model is based on multiple assumptions there, and people are putting all the due diligence there and put based on what's a reasonable and based on fiscal 23 base budget, and with assumption that tax structure doesn't change, no tax rate increase there, and service components doesn't change there. But in reality, we all know there are a lot of other unknowns, non-controllable, that could impact either revenue or expenditure side. Unfortunately, those are beyond the scope of the study, and we cannot adequately forecast that for that purpose. And this is mostly look at the new development impact only on that. The other thing to point it out, even despite all those uncertainties, because the magnitude of the findings here, I think it's still relatively safe to say that the new development projected from Hochul by Design should generate pretty significant positive net impact. The actual dollar, you know, in individual years, it could swing one way or another by a certain margin, but the general conclusion, I think, is very solid. And also another point made by some committee members during the meeting is that, well, whatever the result, it's really based on Hochul by Design, get fully implemented in the timeline with the number of the units and the non-residential property laid out in the plan. And in reality, that's also contingent on a lot of other things such as zoning, regulation, market condition in this period of time. So that's another thing that I know different committee member pointed out there. So that's captured in the report as well. So that's basically the general summary on that. And then after that, we have a section of background. Here is just talk about Hochul by Design. What is the Hochul by Design? That's a long-term general plan updated for the next essentially 18 years on that. It also talk about process, and we just get to the feedbacks from DPZ about the timeline there regarding the process. The next step is going to be provide the draft Hochul by Design will be presented to the planning board, and then following that will be to the county council for their review and adoption there. And again, there's a very detailed attachment, and the attachment also have the links there. So for anybody want to get a deep dive into the document, understand the various details there. And it also talk a little bit about the purpose or the goal of the Hochul by Design. But many chapters are actually including the county website, and some of the highlights, as well as the process, public engagement process, are mentioned in the slides that's attached in attachment 3. The fiscal analysis results here, this is just a little bit more detail about the information. We talked the details here, as well as about the summary data here that shows actually different revenue components, including both on the operating side, plus in the capital side, the multiple taxes or fees that's directly generated from new development. And then there's also operating expenditures there, and the capital cost was adequately accounted for. And both operating and the capital side, the school system accounted for a large portion of that, which is very much in line with what happens in the current county's base budget operating and CIP side. There's also other public safety, public facilities, other needs was also included here. Methodology, we're not going to go over the 48-page details here, which Jeff did a very, very thorough job about laying out every single components, including tables and narratives on that there. Talk about the methodology. Here is just a kind of summary, basically directly extracted from his methodology document, but very concise manner, and all the details can be found in attachment. It's called attachment 2 on methodology and assumptions. And lastly, just very brief conclusion about, there will be positive net fiscal impact, and part of the reason is that the county's primary revenue are from property and income taxes, which Dr. Clinch also mentioned a minute ago there. And then these are mostly directly related to the new development. And in Maryland, it's a little bit unique in terms that local government can tax not only property tax, but also income tax. So make it different in the sense that it was directly tied to to residential development rather than some other cities and counties there. You could sometimes they have a lot of revenue coming from visitors there. That's not the case here. In addition, there's a lot of one-time funding that's directly related to new residential development as well. These are like school surcharge, road excise tax, transit taxes, etc. And that's tied directly to the infrastructure project funding there. As we mentioned earlier, schools are the most significant cost there. And there's a challenge about in the future, how do we maintain and rebuild existing infrastructure? And also, by the way, all those development, regardless the pattern or the pace, if there's a change there, that will actually make the change directly to the budget in terms of the funding and service level there. So that's just the overall summary. So thank you for bearing with me as I kind of try to go through it in detail, but in a quick manner at the same time. So I want to pause to hear whether anybody has questions, comments, or feedbacks that want us to incorporate there.
Holly, Todd here. This was a really good process, and for me was really helpful. But I find myself always falling back on an expression that a colleague had 30 years ago when I was just starting in my career, and that's paper never refused ink. And I'm having a hard time. I mean, I understand all the inputs, I understand all the analysis, I understand how everything falls together, but ultimately, I'm concerned that if our budget is stressed now, as we continue to say as a committee for the last 5 years that I've been involved, and we're acknowledging that the composition of the new housing development and therefore the new incoming population is a lower education and income demographic by nature of the structure of the housing that HOCO by Design is promoting, then how can it not further stress the budget or take it underwater over time because we're not getting the same revenue per new resident as we were in the past?
So I think it's two part of that. So one is that I believe, but I do have we have colleagues from DPZ here, so you know, I would like them to feel free to jump in and provide a little more thoughts on that. But my general understanding is that HOCO by Design was based on both the trend already existing in the county and also consultant. They have some consultant analysis of regarding the market needs for what kind of and how many residential units there, as well as have I think more than 100 town hall meetings with the community. So I'm not sure if the county want to drive how it is, but really based on the study and interaction with all those residents. So all the residents and the people here that developed this there. So I don't think it's a county want to have a define a goal then to go there. I think it's really based on, I wouldn't say scientific, but really based on the research of the market and based on the trend and based on direction in terms of where it goes there. But I don't want to take over on this topic. It's the HOCO by Design is led by the DPZ, so I don't know whether Amy or others in DPZ want to comment on that.
So I think Todd, your point is really a good point. And on page 6 of the document, there's a bullet point that reflects exactly what you said. The very last bullet point. So a changing pace and type of growth. So the potential for growth to slow is there, as we talked about. And it really depends on, to the extent that the vision in HOCO by Design is implemented, right? So if the HOCO by Design is going to call for a largely redevelopment future, the zoning and the policies will need to change to reflect that. We're going to be conducting a gateway master plan. So to the extent that all of that is realize and the market takes advantage of that, then the pace of growth will be impacted. So it may slow or it may increase or it may, and the type of growth, right? You mentioned the more, and Richard mentioned today, more multifamily units, less single family units. It's true, single family units have a high property tax revenues and high income tax levels relative to multifamily. So the changing pace and type of growth will require budget and or level of service adjustments. What we've been used to the past is not going to be the same as what's going to occur in the future. So I think that it's just important for this, the county policymakers and this committee every year to look at what's happening and make these adjustments over time.
And this is Richard. Isn't it also true that the model bakes in there's a lower level of service demand for multifamily? So
Yeah. Yes.
So it adjusts on both ends, that you're going to get, if you think of a housing unit, you're going to get less per housing unit because of the changing composition in terms of revenue, but you'll also, by definition, get lower levels of demand per household unit because of the smaller residential unit or people per unit, and fewer school children per multifamily unit than a single family house.
Yeah,
So
exactly. It does that, and the model projects, I think 60% plus of the future will be multifamily, and the model shows that there's still going to be net positive revenues to the county. So as the HOCO by design is structured, the county is going to experience positive net fiscal impacts from new growth. That's true. Now, if
largely because of one-time revenues associated with the new development, correct?
That's a huge part of it. Yeah. Exactly.
Yeah. And because Richard, didn't you say in your presentation that multifamily residents per unit are only half a person per unit lower, even though the square footage is much, which suggests much lower than that?
Yeah, I said that, so that half a person is then becomes fewer dollar demands per household.
Right.
So it's translating into that. So it's still net positive. However, the net positive, I would estimate, would be lower per unit.
So a good way to look at that, I think, also is, let's say we were to project the future as the last 20 years happened, where there might have been a higher percentage of single family detached. The net revenues would have been higher.
Right.
So we're still having net revenues. They're just relative to the past, they're not as high as they used to. So that's why this bullet point 6 is an important thing to consider.
Right, because I guess what you're saying in bullet point 6 is that spending per resident as opposed to spending per household will necessarily have to be adjusted because revenue per resident is going down with the incoming new residents relative to what we're accustomed to through the 80s, 90s, and 2000s.
Yeah, I think that's a good point there. And Todd, as you mentioned that what has been happening in the last decade or two, and based on the HOCO by design, will continue to happen, this housing portfolio change, right? And over time, that's another, besides the aging community, that's another important drivers about the overall revenue versus service on that. And so as a result, new development will continue to generate net gains. But as Jeff pointed out, because the portfolio going forward there, it wouldn't be, compared to 20 years ago, it would have more net revenue otherwise. So in other words, it is slowing down. It still generates net positive impact, but it's slowing down. And given time, that will continue to impact the overall county's net revenue gains. And also its overall revenue growth will continue to fuel that.
Holly, it's Ellen. But in reality, I think what we're saying is that there's going to be lower net return from this, but also because of the limited nature of the new growth, what we will eventually see is and we can't consider in this scenario, is what happens in the resale market and the change where that turnover now changes. And so if existing single family turns over to new rising income young families with that may bring in some additional, but all we can look at here is what the new development is looking at. So we have to recognize that this is a piece within a larger puzzle, and all we're doing here is reflecting on that. But there may be some offsetting, some increases in net positives as our aging population eventually cycles out or not. I mean, we'll see. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's a good point.
And I think this is Richard, to some extent baked into the escalation in, housing costs. So we're seeing strong growth in the resale market, which are all houses, not just new houses,
Right.
new and existing. So to some extent, that's baked into that very high, the second highest in Maryland, uh, cost per house.
Yeah, really good discussion there. Any other thoughts?
Yeah, just one other thing, because Josh brought this up, and I think it was, I mean, I wrote it down. I thought it was kind of compelling, with just this ongoing need to attract dual income educated young families to
Yeah,
keep things moving here, and that is that's critical, particularly since we're changing the composition of our incoming demographic with our new product. We have to continue to attract those types of young families even into our existing housing stock. I don't know where it fits in this, honestly. I'm just spouting, but and perhaps it doesn't. I mean, we're tasked with looking at the numbers associated with HOCO by design, not this larger puzzle that Ellen's referring to.
Which I think is why it's important to make sure that we make the context of this analysis clear, and that we reflect that we have, been maybe more conservative in looking at this in the study, because we recognize that it's part of a larger picture. And I just think that's the important thing in this particular piece, is to reflect on what our task was, to make sure we set it within a context where there's some understanding of how this is part of a larger whole.
Right, stress that this is really a marginal analysis for new
right.
growth only, to look at the impacts from HOCO by design. Yeah, that's a good, to stress that
Right.
would be
We need
important.
to, yeah. I think there's one piece we talk about that, but we can expand that a little bit, just emphasize that what's this model supposed to do, what it cannot do. The other thing,
Yes.
Todd, you mentioned earlier about the workforce, and you and Josh both mentioned the workforce development, especially to attract the young professional. I think that in the March 1st report, because that's where we could put different policy pieces there, that might be really good discussion point there. And also folks can also brainstorm on that there, because that clearly is one of the both factor of concern, but also potential place we can work on the policy side, right? So if there are some thoughts there at the meeting, I think it's not next one, but the following week, they're discussing about all those recommendations. I think that's a really good point that was probably a little more lengthy discussion on that. But I think it's really something we could include it in SAAC report. May or may not be in this one, but for the March report, that would be good. And also, since Ellen, you're here, I want to ask, like, because in the past you have kindly helped us in some of the language polishing of the report there. Are you available in next couple of days and can help us again?
Yeah,
Mhm.
and that's why I really thought it was important to hear what the reactions were to the
Yeah.
report from the committee and get a sense so that we can go forward with a basic consensus on what we have here and just fine tune the language a little bit. Yeah, I'm okay.
Okay, thank you. Any other thoughts? Okay. If no further discussion, I would say that if you have new thoughts coming up or word or simply just word editing there, please send to me and Paul no later than tomorrow by COB tomorrow, which is Wednesday. So then we can work with Ellen and then try to just do a little bit fine tuning and to make sure we don't miss anything. And then we'll bring back to next meeting. And what I'll try to do is, if we can, we will try to send you the revised fine tuning tentative final report by this coming weekend. So, and we will put both insured folder of the committee, but also send in email so you get a chance to do a thorough review. And then, so if you see anything, let us know. So when we run it to next Tuesday, ideally we can just spend a few minutes and then just kind of approve it, because as we mentioned, there are so many other things to discuss at the next meeting. All right, thanks everyone for all the discussion and good points, and also special thanks to Jeff and the DPZ team for very, very hard work for all the fiscal impact analysis, for working with the committee, sharing thoughts and making changes there, and also this whole by design. This is a big undertaking itself on that through the last few years, and it will continue next few years in terms of implementation. So just a big thanks to everybody, and also for the committee for the contribution to this process. This is really meaningful, and I'm really happy that executive in his executive order engaged the committee given all this expertise and talents in the committee to get a chance to review and provide the feedbacks to him. So I would say that the government is very thankful for everybody's engagement and good thoughts there. So with that, I will finish the meeting today, and we will meet again next Tuesday at the same time, and we will talk about at that point another set of important subject besides voting on the final report on this one. We'll talk about school's budget and also general fund revenue projection, multi-year projection, debt service projection, as well as the credit rating. So look forward to see you next week. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Holly.
Thank you.
Thanks, Holly.